take my little medicines because I think it helps me to do that. So those are my primary biases. I'm also a lesbian. This is my partner, Barbara Kinsman, in the back of the room. I dragged her to just have a little company. I was hoping there would be a lot of snow, but boring. I have 2.2 children in a station wagon. No, that's not right. I have 2 children, both of whom are grown, and 4 grandchildren in a minivan. So those are my major biases right there. I say that the disability rights movement is a civil rights movement very deliberately because what it's not is a human rights movement in most cases, although I think those things can overlap at times. I'm sure each of you has a definition of what you consider to be human rights. But what the disability rights movement is looking for is civil rights. That is, the rights that individuals are entitled to as members of a civil society, specifically the United States. There is also a broad international movement for people with disability rights. Other countries are in different places, and I haven't worked in that movement very much, so I'm not going to talk about that. There's a ton of material on the web if you're interested in the international civil rights movement. People with disabilities looked at the things that other people were able to do as a matter of course in our society, and they said, I want to do that too. It's that simple. People with disabilities are not trying to change the world. You know, like the movement for African Americans in this country, especially like the feminist movement in this country, there were very few people in those movements who actually wanted to transform society in any way. Some very modern feminists do, and obviously there always have been a few folks. But in point of fact, people with disabilities just want to do what everybody else does. They want to communicate in the same ways that everybody else do, that is regularly and easily and with facility. Transportation. The Montgomery Bus Boycott was one of the first, I guess the second major physical demonstration of the need for African Americans to have free movement in our society. Before the Montgomery Bus Boycott and some events that happened later, people who were African American could not get on the same bus and or could not sit in the same places. They could not travel freely because there was not so much as a water fountain, much less a hotel that they could stay in. And so they demanded free access to moving themselves about in our society. Bobby cannot move himself about in our society. He can't do that the same way I did. I come up the front steps, he comes up the ramp in the back. If there's a ramp at all, right? You know, very often there is not. So many people with disabilities do not have the ability to move freely in our society. And so all of the issues that you can think of that might surround that sort of general transportation rubric. Curb cuts. You can't go down the street without curb cuts. Subway. You can't get on the subway because the elevator's always broken, and if the elevator's broken, you can't get down there, and usually you get to the place you're going, you can't get up either, and you have to turn around and go someplace else. If you think about the massive waste of time when people get on the subway and go to where they're going, and when they get there, something as simple and technologically feasible as a working elevator prevents them from getting to work on time, prevents them, and by the way, forget this business if it has to be something necessary like work. Maybe somebody just wants to, I don't know, go watch a stripper. I don't care what they want to go. They got a right to do it. Play a game of bridge, you know, have dinner. Everybody is entitled to move freely in our society. So a large part of disability rights has been about transportation, housing. We all know about the history of housing discrimination in our society and the eons. Women could not own property, they were property when things started out back in merry old England. Finally, women were able to own property if they were single, if they were married. They really didn't have control over their property. Finally, this came up to the point where today, almost without exception, women are able to own property in their own name and in their own right. The ownership of property is crucial because it allows people to have the kind of homes that they want to live in. There are all sorts of economic advantages and stuff like that. People with disabilities very often are forced to live with homes that are hopelessly inaccessible, and that affects their lives in some pretty tremendous ways. I used to work for the DC Housing Authority, which is public housing in the District of Columbia. You can imagine that public housing in the District of Columbia was not what you call fine in any instance, but I knew a number of people who lived in walk-ups on the second or third floor who could not get out of their own apartments and did not leave their own apartments for years. We often talk about people with disabilities being in jail. You're in jail if you cannot leave your apartment for any reason, not for a social reason, not to go to school, not for a business reason. Obviously, you're in jail. The other kinds of issues that have been crucial over the years to people with disabilities are issues involving communication. People who are blind and people who are deaf really started the movement years ago. 1817 or something. I don't remember. You probably have all that data a lot better than I do. Recognizing that communication with others was a crucial part of living together with people and having a full life, they began to develop ways to do that. Blind people began to develop ways to read, and after some debate in the late 1800s, settled down to a couple of ways of using Braille that makes it possible for people who are blind to have that more extensive learning and more extensive understanding that comes from being able to read broad passages instead of just being able to listen to a few things. The movement for deaf people to communicate with one another and with hearing people began in France but quickly jumped to the United States. And people in the United States developed a beautiful and wonderful language, which MJ, I'm sure, will talk about a lot more, and I don't want to spend too much time on it because she's got that role, but the ability to communicate with one another, none of us in this society can have rich and full lives unless we can communicate with one another. So communication became another crucial part of the disability rights movement in this country. Am I almost up?
You've got about 4 minutes, and then you will transform.
And then I will
into
become
Jim.
Then I will become Jim?
Yes.
All right, you have to prompt me.
I will. I'm ready and waiting to
Jim
prompt.
stuff. Okay. One of the earlier modern, how do I say that? Let's say in the 70s, began a rather strong movement to educate people with disabilities. Before that, people with disabilities were pretty much locked in a corner, and very little effort, if any, was made to educate them. And Helen Keller was wonderful, but she was one, and the rest of them, the rest of folks were ignored. I will say the current state of that particular movement is not great. Most people with disabilities continue to get very poor educations. As a result of getting poor educations, most people with disabilities continue to get rather limited jobs. The education system on the whole